Chapter 10 of Brazilian Gold Mine Mystery by Andy Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Tomlinson. Chapter 10, Trapped by the Headhunters. From the babble that followed, Biff realized that the damage had been done. The bearers shied away as though the tiny heads were alive and ready to attack them. They made a hurried retreat towards the trail from which the safari had come. Out of their excited chatter, Biff could distinguish the words, "Makuu here, we go home, quick!" Biff, meanwhile, was studying the shrunken heads in amazement. Reduced to the size of baseballs, their human appearance was preserved in miniature form. Cords closed the lips, and feathered ornaments hung from the ears of these grotesque trophies. Though Biff had heard how headhunters dealt with their victims, he had thought of shrunken heads as curios rather than as something gruesome. But here, on a tropical riverbank, where the deadly Makus might pop up in person, the grisly trophies were fearful things indeed. When Biff looked from the tiny heads in Nara's hands to the scared faces of the clustered natives, he noted a striking similarity between them. He knew that the natives saw it too, each picturing himself as a headhunter's prospective victim. Mr. Whitman and Jacome were trying to quiet the wild babble, but to no avail. Mr. Brewster gestured to the shrunken heads and told Nara, "Put those away." Old Joe wrapped the souvenirs with a chuckle, as though he relished the confusion he had caused. Jacome approached and spoke solemnly to Mr. Brewster. "It is no good," Jacome said. "They want pay. They want to go back to Santa Isabel, far away from Makuu." "What about you, Jacome?" inquired Mr. Brewster. "Do you want to go with them?" "I want to go, yes," admitted Jacome, "but I want more to stay with you. So I stay." Mr. Brewster turned to Kamuka. "And you, Kamuka?" "I stay with Biff." "Good boy." Biff clapped Kamuka on the shoulder. "I knew a couple of little shrunken heads wouldn't scare you." "I have seen such heads before," rejoined Kamuka calmly, "but always heads of men. Never any head of a boy. So why should heads scare me?" Mr. Brewster paid off the bearers in Brazilian Cruzeiro notes, saying he would give them double if they stayed with the safari. But there were no takers. In English, Mr. Whitman undertoned the suggestion. "Keep talking to them. They still may stay." "No, it must be voluntary," returned Mr. Brewster, "as with Jacome and Kamuka. Otherwise, they will desert us later." The bearers hastily packed their few belongings, took a supply of food, and started back along the trail. Mr. Brewster remarked to Joe Nara, "Now, I suppose we shall have to go upriver in the Xanadu." "We can't," returned Nara. "We had to haul the cruiser up on shore below the big rapids. The friendly natives who helped were the ones who told us about the Makus and gave us the shrunken heads. We've come the rest of the way in a canoe." Nara paused and gestured down the riverbank. "We hid it there," he added, "so we could wait for you." "We have rubber boats in our equipment," stated Mr. Brewster. "We can inflate them for the trip upriver." "But there are many more rapids," objected Nara, "with no natives to help you carry the boats past them. You will have to go overland by a back trail." "Where will we find new bearers?" "From a native village a mile or so in there." Nara gestured to another jungle path. "I'll send Igo Anubi along to introduce you." Mr. Brewster delegated the task of hiring the bearers to Hal Whitman, who left, accompanied by Jacome and Nara's two Wai Indians. Biff and Kamuka took a swim in the safe water of the river. As they sat drying themselves in the sun, the boys watched Nara describe the route to Mr. Brewster. With a stick, old Joe drew a wiggly line in the sand and said, "This here is the Rio Negro. I keep going up it until I turn east on another river." Nara made a line that wiggled to the right. "I don't know its right name, if it has any, but the natives call it—" "Rio Del Moretti," interposed Mr. Brewster. "The River of Death." "Lew Kirby told you that, did he?" "Yes. That's where he said I'd find you. somewhere up the Rio Del Moretti. Nara showed a pleasant smile at this new token of a bond between his former partner Lew Kirby and Mr. Brewster. "Your trail will bring you to the Rio del Moretti," resumed Nara, "but you will strike it many miles above the mine." "How many miles above?" "I wouldn't know. I've never gone by that route. But the native bearers will know when they reach the Rio del Moretti." "And then?" "Then you follow it downstream until you meet me." "Where will that be?" Nara eyed Mr. Brewster in quick, bird-like fashion, then decided to answer the question. "At a split rock on the north bank," stated Nara. "They call it La Porta del Diablo, or the Devil's Gate. Come through the gateway and continue up the ravine. It leads to Eldorado. I will meet you on the way." Mr. Whitman and Jacome were coming from the jungle with a crew of natives. Mr. Brewster spoke quickly to Nara. "Don't show those shrunken heads to these chaps." This time, old Joe kept his shrunken heads out of sight. He and his two Wai-Wais left to get their canoe, and soon the Indians were paddling up the River Negro. Joe Nara was waving from behind two heaps of packs and luggage. Mr. Brewster, meanwhile, had opened a box of trinkets that he was distributing to create goodwill. Eagerly, the natives accepted colored marbles, bright shiny beads, little round mirrors, and other gewgaws. Biff saw Kamuka looking longingly at the eye-catching gifts and mentioned it to his father, who promptly gave some to the Indian boy. Kamuka took some marbles and a mirror, but with a slight show of reluctance. It was evident that he valued things that were useful as well as showy. Among the assortment, Biff found a small microscope. He handed it to Kamuka with the comment, "Here's something you will really like. This glass makes little things look big." Biff held the lens above an ant that was crawling along a dried palm leaf. "Here, see for yourself." Kamuka tried the simple microscope and smiled when he saw that the insect appeared larger. "I like it," he declared, "but I like mirror better, because I can flash sunlight, like you did." "You can use this glass with the sun too," Biff said. "Hold it close to the leaf. That's right. Now tilt it so the sun shines through. Keep it that way and wait." Kamuka didn't have to wait long. The sun's focused rays soon burned a hole in the leaf. Kamuka tried another leaf with the same result. He turned to Biff and remarked, "With a lot of dry leaves all in one pile, you can start big fire with this, maybe?" "You catch on fast, Kamuka," complimented Biff. "Yes, a burning glass is often used to start a fire. It's a right handy thing to have." Kamuka pocketed the microscope along with the mirror and his other new possessions. In a serious tone, he said, "Time to get ready for trail now." Biff noted that Jacome was assigning the new bearers to their packs and other equipment. "Yes, recess is over," acknowledged Biff. "Let's get our packs and join the parade." The boys found, much to their relish, that they were not needed as pack carriers. Mr. Whitman had hired a few spare bearers at the village, and since this new crew was fresh, with less than half a day's journey before sunset, Mr. Brewster had decided to let them take the full load. "You two can go ahead," Mr. Brewster told Biff and Kamuka. "The villagers tell me that the trail is well marked, so you won't miss it. But there may be short stretches that need clearing before we come along." It worked out as Mr. Brewster anticipated. At a few spots, Biff and Kamuka encountered tangled undergrowth, which they managed to hack away with their machetes by the time the safari caught up with them. As they were starting ahead again, Mr. Brewster noted the position of the sun. "Allow about an hour," he told the boys, "then start looking for a good campsite. You can wait there for us." Biff enjoyed the carefree late afternoon hike through the vast green vault of the jungle, particularly with Kamuka, who was quick to spot all forms of wildlife. Once, Kamuka pointed to a curious creature with a huge shell that was moving across the trail. Biff looked just in time to see it roll up into a solid ball and play dead. The thing was an armadillo, the most heavily armored denizen of the jungle. Again, Kamuka called a halt while they watched what looked like a teddy bear with white legs attached to a gray, black-banded body. It was attacking a huge anthill, darting a long, thin tongue from its snouted muzzle. The creature was a giant anteater, feeding on its favorite prey. Kamuka was quick as well as accurate with the machete. Once, while slashing at a low bush, he changed the direction of his swing. The long blade whisked within inches of Biff's shin. As Biff sprang back, he saw the actual target of Kamuka's quick aim. The machete had clipped the head from a snake, which had been rearing to strike at Biff's leg. Pale yellow in color with brown diamond-shaped spots, it somewhat resembled a rattler, except that it had sounded no loud warning. Mapapire, defined Kamuka. Very bad. Worse poison than curare, like Makuu use on arrows. Biff decided that the snake was a species of bushmaster, one of the most deadly of tropical reptiles. Neat work, Kamuka, Biff exclaimed gratefully. You sure were Johnny on the spot that time. Johnny on the spot, repeated Kamuka. What does that mean? Somebody who is around when you need them most. A troop of red howler monkeys were hopping from one high tree to another, sometimes hanging on to branches only by their tails. The boys were watching those acrobatics when a sudden stir occurred in the brush around them. Up from the bushes popped a group of tawny natives, wearing odd-shaped aprons made of hides, decorated with bright feathers and large, dull beads. Their faces and bodies were streaked with scarlet dye that looked like war paint. Some were holding bows with arrows on drawn strings. Others were raising long blowguns to their lips. All were aimed toward a central target, the spot where Biff and Kamuka stood. Biff felt himself sink inwardly as he heard Kamuka gasp the word Makuu. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Brazilian Gold Mine Mystery by Andy Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Tomlinson. Chapter 11. A Sudden Surprise. Slowly, the Makuu warriors closed in on the two boys. The sharp eyes that glared from painted faces were on the watch for even the slightest move. Kamuka muttered to Biff, "Drop machete right away." As Kamuka let his machete fall, Biff did the same. The inner circle of Makus dropped their own weapons and sprang forward upon the boys. The two were captured without a struggle. The Makus brought out rawhide bowstrings and tied the wrists of the prisoners behind them. They also tied their ankles together, but in hobble fashion, far enough apart so that they could still take short steps. Two of their captors picked up the machetes. Another snatched Biff's wristwatch and tugged it loose. Next, they were finding prizes in the pockets of the prisoners. Biff's scout knife and his father's metal mirror, the marbles and the little mirror that Kamuka had been given earlier in the day. Kamuka seemed indifferent to all that happened. He braced his feet so that the Makus had trouble pushing him around. Biff copied that procedure and found that it helped. Their captors were in a hurry because all the while, the cries of the howler monkeys were becoming louder. Above the din, Kamuka said calmly, "If they hear this back at the safari, they will know that we are having trouble. They will come to help us." "But how will they know what is happening?" "You will see why, soon." Leaping monkeys formed dark red streaks against the deep green of the jungle foliage. A few Makus were guarding Biff and Kamuka. The rest spread out through the brush, where they squatted as they had originally. Gradually, the commotion lessened up in the treetops. Then, as the monkeys returned to normal, the Makus bobbed up again. Now, their bows and blowguns were pointed upward. The air was suddenly filled with arrows and darts that found their marks high above. Monkeys began tumbling from the trees, while the rest scattered, howling louder than before. From the distance came answering chatter, like an alarm spreading through the jungle. "The Makuu come across river to hunt monkeys," Kamuka told Biff. "We heard monkeys talk. I should have known Makuu were here." The Makus gathered up the dead monkeys and marched Biff and Kamuka back along the trail. New howls were coming from far off. "You see," undertoned Kamuka, "maybe Safari will hear and come fast." "Or go the other way faster," put in Biff. "Those villagers are scared by the very thought of meeting up with Makus." But your father will come with Mr. Whitman. I only hope they won't fall into the same trap." "They will not fall into trap. They will have Jacome with them. He will be on watch." Biff's hopes rose at Kamuka's words, only to fall again as their Makuu captors turned suddenly from the trail. Instead of trampling the side path, the Makus moved stealthily in single file, pushing the captured boys into the line ahead of them. They spread the jungle plants as they moved through them, then let them fall back into place, leaving no trace of their route. Literally, the entire party was swallowed by the jungle. Biff groaned loud enough for Kamuka to hear. "Fine chance we have now," Biff said. "They will never find us, unless the natives know where the Makuu village is." "Makuu never make village," replied Kamuka. "All they do is tear down huts that belong to other people." The procession was moving straight westward towards the setting sun. That at least made sense to Biff, for it proved that the Makus had come from across the Rio Negro, as they usually did. Evidently they had found the fishing poor, so they had gone on a monkey hunt instead. Soon the procession reached the Makuu Camp. This was a small natural clearing where the Makus had chopped down a few palm trees. Women of the tribe were sewing palm leaves together to form roofs for crude shelters around a central fire. While the hunters skinned monkeys for the evening meal, other tribesmen gathered around Biff and Kamuka, prodding them as if they were curiosities. Their hands were finally released and they were allowed to eat. Biff was glad they were fed leftover fish instead of monkey meat. Then they were marched to two small trees. Biff's wrists were tied behind him around a tree, and he was allowed to slide down to a sitting position. Kamuka was tied in the same fashion to another tree, only a few feet away. Liana ropes were used instead of thongs, but the knots were very tight and solid. Other Makus tied their ankles in the same manner, so that escape would be difficult, if not impossible. As the Makus moved away and gathered around the slowly dying fire, Biff saw their ruddy faces and spoke to Kamuka. "They sure look bloodthirsty with their faces all done up in war paint." "That is not for war," said Kamuka. "It is for hunger. They will wear the paint all night, for luck in catching monkeys tomorrow." Biff and Kamuka were not too uncomfortable that night. They slept fitfully until dawn, when the women brought them water but offered them no food. When they were alone again, Biff asked, "What do you think of headhunters now, Kamuka? Will they let us grow up before they shrink our heads?" "Maybe," returned Kamuka. "Sometimes they take prisoners for members of the tribe. But I do not want to be a Makuu. I want to be Johnny on the spot." "You're on the spot, all right. We both are. If I only had something to cut these ropes." "I have something Makuu did not find. I have it in back pocket where I can get it easy. Burning glass." Kamuka's words roused Biff to an eager pitch. "Get it, Kamuka," he exclaimed. "Try to hold it into the sunlight and turn it towards my hands." "But it will burn your hands." "Not long. It won't. I'll tell you when to move it and which way to tilt it." Kamuka soon had the little microscope tilted towards the sun. Biff repressed a sudden ouch and then said calmly, "Just a little higher, Kamuka. Hold it there a moment. No, a little more. Now the other way." "I smell rope burning," Kamuka said. "Hold it just as it is," urged Biff. Soon Biff, too, could smell the burning rope. A minute later, he found that the bonds yielded when he tried to pull his wrists apart. Finally, the rope broke completely, and with one hand free, Biff was able to take the microscope and work on Kamuka's bonds. By now, most of the Makuu hunters had left the camp, and the few who remained were still asleep. The boys worked on their ankle ropes unnoticed, but found them so tight they had to take turns burning them. Finally free, they realized that their biggest problem lay ahead. "We can't both make a run for it at once," whispered Biff, "or they might wake up and spot us. You slide for the brush first, Kamuka. If they still see me, they may not notice that you have gone." "But I can't leave you here alone, Biff." "You won't be leaving me. I'll give you time to work around the clearing. Then if they see me start to leave, you can raise a yell and draw them your way." "Very good, Biff. We try it." The ruse worked better than they had hoped. Kamuka gained the edge of the clearing with ease. Biff gave him due time to get properly posted, then followed the same route. They had chosen it well, for it was not only the closest edge to the clearing, it was directly toward the rising sun, which would tend to dazzle anyone who looked that way. Once in the jungle, Biff kept close to the clearing as he circled it, calling softly to Kamuka until they finally met. Again, the sun proved helpful. They had been headed toward it when they were brought here as prisoners, late in the previous afternoon. So now they had only to move toward the morning sun to reach the jungle trail. It was slow going, as they had to be wary of animals in the brush, yet all the while they felt the urge to hurry in case their escape had been discovered back at the Makuu Camp. At last, however, they came upon the trail. Then came the question, which direction should they take? "The safari must have come as far as we did," declared Biff. "In fact, probably a lot farther, as they were supposed to keep on coming until they overtook us." "But when they didn't find us," said Kamuka, "they must have turned back to look." "You may be right," decided Biff. "They could have figured, too, that we missed the trail somewhere along the line. I'll tell you what, let's go back along the trail a couple of miles anyway. If we don't meet them, we'll know they are up ahead." "And all the time," added Kamuka, "we keep good sharp look for Makuu." The final point was so important that both Biff and Kamuka kept paying more attention to the bordering jungle than to the trail itself. Every sound from a bird call to a monkey howl might mean that Makuu hunters were about. So could the slightest stir among the jungle flowers and the banks of surrounding plants, where at any moment painted faces topped with wavy hair might come popping into sight as they had the afternoon before. But there wasn't a trace of motion in all that sultry setting until the boys reached a place where the trail took a short, sharp turn around the slanted trunk of a fallen ceiba tree. Biff, in the lead, gave a quick, glad cry as he saw native bearers coming toward them, bowed under the weight of the packs they carried. At the head of the column strode a white-clad man wearing a tropical helmet. At sight of him, Biff turned and called to Kamuka. "Here's Mr. Whitman coming with the whole safari. We're safe now, Kamuka. Come on." With that, Biff dashed forward, only to be caught by the shoulders and spun full about, his arm twisted in back of him. Biff's captors shoved him straight toward the leader of the safari, and the boys saw for the first time that the man in white wasn't Mr. Whitman. Looking down from beneath the pith helmet was the ever-smiling face of Nicholas Serbot, tinted an unearthly green in the subdued glow of the jungle. Over Biff's shoulder leered the face of his captor, Big Pepito. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Brazilian Gold Mine Mystery by Andy Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Tomlinson. Chapter 12, Between Two Fires. Biff's first concern was for Kamuka. He managed to dart a quick look along the trail, hoping to shout a warning to his companion. Then Biff caught himself, fearful that such a call would turn attention in Kamuka's direction. The warning wasn't needed. Kamuka had witnessed Biff's rapid capture and had taken action on his own. With uncanny instinct, Kamuka had found an opening in the seemingly solid wall of jungle and had already dived from sight. One man, however, had seen the green mass close behind Kamuka's quick-moving form. That man was Urubu. He raised his rifle and fired into the thick foliage 3 times in quick succession. As Urubu paused, Biff appealed frantically to Serbot. "Don't let him shoot again." Serbot ordered Urubu to lower his rifle, which the guide did. At the same time, Urubu grinned, for he'd seen no ripple in the jungle leaves beyond the spot where he had first aimed. "Perhaps," purred Serbot, "Urubu is trying to shoot an anaconda, the way he did the other day." "Or some other jungle creature," added Pepito over Biff's shoulder, "like those we heard run away." Biff guessed that they were trying to draw out facts from him to learn if he and Kamuka had followed Luiz and listened in on the discussion that had shaped the later events. As Biff tightened his lips, Determined not to answer, Yorubu became impatient. "And maybe," put in the leering guide, "I just now tried to kill some person the way Luiz was chased and killed." "What happened to Luiz was his own fault," Biff argued hotly. "He tried to kill my father first, with a knife." "Your bearers did not tell us that," stated Serbot smoothly. "We met them on the way back to Santa Isabel, and they told us that Whitman had fired at Luiz, who ran into quicksand. Where we tried to save him. Did they tell you that?" "Yes, they told us that, but not that Luiz had tried to kill your father. That happened before they even woke up. By then, Luiz had started to run, so naturally Mr. Whitman went after him." "The boy lies," snarled Yorubu. "The bearers did not give you foolish talk like this." "They gave us other foolish talk," reminded Serbot. "They scared our crew by saying there were Macus around here." "But there are Macus around," exclaimed Biff. "Their camp is only a few miles away from here. I know because the Macus had me tied up as a prisoner all last night." The effect on Serbot's party was electric. Even before Yorubu could translate the words to the bearers, they were dropping their packs, ready to take flight, for they recognized the name Macus when Biff mentioned it. But Serbot, raising his smooth tone to a surprisingly strong pitch, spoke in a mixture of Portuguese and native dialect that Biff managed to understand. "Where will you go?" demanded Serbot. "Do you think you will be safe by running away like frightened deer while the Macus are looking for just such prey? If there are Macus all around, as the boy says, there is nothing for us to do but go on and be ready for them." All this while, Pepito had retained his grip on Biff, but had been gradually relaxing the hold. Now, at Serbot's order, he released Biff entirely, but still kept a wary eye on him. Biff longed to dash into the jungle and look for Kamuka, but again he managed to restrain himself. The chances were that Urubu's shots had missed and that Kamuka was lying low in the motionless foliage. To race after him and draw new gunfire would be the worst thing that Biff could possibly do. So he waited patiently until the safari started on. Then Serbot took the lead, telling Biff to stay beside him, while Pepito guarded one flank and Urubu the other, all three carrying ready rifles. The bearers stepped along close together, eager to get through the Makuu territory. "Keep a sharp watch," Serbot told Biff. "The Macus caught you yesterday. Don't let them trap you again today." Occasionally, Biff managed to look back, hoping that Kamuka had come from cover and was stealing along behind the safari. Soon Biff gave that up, realizing that if Kamuka had decided to follow them, he would be staying completely out of sight. When they reached the spot where the Macus had bobbed up the day before, Biff recognized it. He turned to Serbot and said, "This is where the headhunters were yesterday." Serbot swung about and ordered the safari to halt. As the bearers set down their packs, Biff studied their faces and realized that some were members of the group that Whitman had organized, the natives who had started home when Joe Nara had exhibited the shrunken heads. Their meeting with Serbot's safari must have scared some of Serbot's crew into going back to Santa Isabel. But Serbot or Urubu must have talked some of Whitman's men into coming along as replacements. Now Biff understood how Serbot had learned so much about Luiz. After a brief rest, Serbot asked Biff, "Were there many headhunters here?" "Yes," replied Biff, "a lot of them." "And which way did they take you?" Biff pointed to the west. Smoothly, Serbot asked, "If there were so many, how did you manage to escape today?" "Because most of them had left before dawn to go hunting," replied Biff. "That's why I was afraid of running into them." "Good. We'll be on the watch for them." Serbot ordered the safari forward. At the end of another mile, they came to a side trail which cut sharply in the direction of the Rio Negro. After a rapid discussion with Urubu, so thick with dialect that Biff could not understand it, Serbot decided to take the river route. As they started along it, Serbot spoke to Biff, using the smooth, easy tone that reminded Biff of their first meeting in the airplane above the Amazon. "If the Macus are hunting along the main trail," declared Serbot, "they will never bother to come this way. That makes it all the safer for us. Anyone taking the main trail would be gone, for certain. That was passed along by Urubu to the bearers, who not only were pleased, but quickened their pace, hoping to get out of Makuu territory all the faster. But Biff's heart sank, for he was afraid there would be no catching up with his own safari now. Then Biff noted that Serbot was studying him steadily. Evidently, the smiling man was anxious to learn which way the other safari had gone, and was hoping that Biff's change of manner would give the fact away. Suddenly, there came an interruption that gave Biff a cause for real alarm. "Listen," he exclaimed. From the treetops came a running chatter that seemed to carry like a wave from somewhere off in the jungle. Biff recognized the excited gabble. "The howler monkeys," he told Serbot. "That's the way they acted after the Macus shot some of them with arrows yesterday." Serbot tried to gauge the direction of the sound, then ordered the safari onward, faster. They followed the rough, irregular trail until they reached a spot where the chatter lessened and finally quieted altogether. Serbot waved for the bearers to set down their packs. The order came just in time. The bearers themselves pointed to heads and shoulders that bobbed from behind trees and bushes. Terrified, the bearers shouted, "Makuu!" Serbot dived behind a pack to use as a shelter. Pepito and Urubu did the same, expecting Biff to join them with the huddling bearers, for spears, arrows, and darts were now skimming towards them. Instead, Biff acted upon sudden impulse and raced along the jungle trail. He heard guns blast in back of him, but knew Serbot and others were too busy shooting at the attacking headhunters to worry about him. Biff passed a turn in the trail and knew that he was safe from gunfire, but he had his eye on an opening in the jungle another 100 feet ahead. There, Biff was sure he could duck from sight the way Kamuka had, but Biff was becoming too hopeful too soon. Less than halfway to the spot, Biff halted in his tracks as the foliage parted and a painted Makuu warrior loomed in sight. Armed with bow and arrow, the deadly marksman was already taking aim at Biff with his bowstring fully drawn. Another moment and the poison-tipped arrow would be in flight, allowing Biff no chance of escape at such close range. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Brazilian Gold Mine Mystery by Andy Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Tomlinson. Chapter 13, The River of Death. The twang of the headhunter's bowstring was drowned by an explosive burst from farther up the trail. With it, the Makuu marksman gave an upward, sideward jolt at the very instant the arrow was leaving his bow. The feathered missile zimmed high and wide by a matter of scant inches, for Biff could hear it whir past his ear and stop with a sharp thud in a tree trunk just behind him. A piercing yell seemed to echo the timely gunshot. The Makuu had dropped his bow and was gripping his left arm with his right hand as he dived off into the jungle. The bullet had jolted the bow from the Makuu's grasp, sending the arrow wide. Now, looking up the trail, Biff saw his father hurrying in his direction, rifle in hand. Biff started to meet him, shouting, "Dad," only to have Mr. Brewster wave him back. Next, Biff saw his father take a quick shot at another Makuu huntsman who had popped up in the brush, only to drop from sight again. Now, from the other side of the trail, a brown head and arm poked from among a mass of blossoms that sprouted from the thin bark of a fallen tree trunk. Biff heard the familiar call. "Biff, come this way, quick!" It was Kamuka. Biff vaulted the log and took shelter behind it, but tried to shake off Kamuka's restraining hand as he saw his father come along the trail with Mr. Whitman and Jacome. All three were taking long-range shots at distant Macus. "I have to warn Dad," Biff explained. "Serbot's party is just around the bend." "He knows," assured Kamuka. "We were coming back when we heard their guns, so we hurry fast." "Coming back along this trail?" "That's right. When they couldn't find us on the main trail, they think maybe we take this one. So today, they take it to look for us." "Then you sneaked ahead of Serbot's party after you ducked from sight. But how did you know to take this side trail when you reached it?" "Jacome leaves special message that I understand. Twist of grass and broken jungle branch are as good as mirror signal sometimes. Mr. Brewster and his fellow marksmen had rifles with a longer range than the Makuu weapons. Also, they were able to shift positions along the trail, preventing the Makus from picking a point of attack. Serbot's party, on the contrary, had first let the Makus close in on them. Then, in solidly entrenching themselves, they had lost all chance of mobility. Soon they would have been surrounded if Mr. Brewster and his companions hadn't come along to scatter the foe. Kamuka called Biff's attention to that fact. "Maku run like scared deer," said Kamuka. "But now your father is telling Mr. Whitman and Jacome to stop shooting. Why?" "I guess Dad wants to keep the Makus around as a threat," returned Biff grimly, "until he sees what Serbot intends to do. Urubu might take a pot shot at anybody." Kamuka gave a knowing nod. "You tell me." "Then you saw it was Urubu who fired after you?" "Sure, Biff. I took long enough to see him aim. I tell Mr. Brewster all that happened, too." Evidently, Mr. Brewster had profited by Kamuka's report. He had reached the bend where he was in direct sight of Serbot's entrenched party, but he was motioning for Whitman and Jacome to stay behind him. Serbot looked up from behind a pack, then gave a wary glance in the direction the Makus had gone. A few arrows came whizzing from high among the tree boughs, but they landed wide. They were sufficient, however, to shape Serbot's next decision. Serbot ordered Pepito and Urubu to resume their shooting after the Makus. At the same time, Serbot clambered over the packs and came along the path to meet Mr. Brewster, who in his turn ordered Mr. Whitman and Jacome to renew their fire on the distant headhunters. Rifles barked in unison. Biff and Kamuka joined their party in time to catch a last glimpse of the routed headhunters. "They won't stop until they reach their camp," declared Biff, "and maybe they'll still keep going on from there." "Until they reach the Rio Negro," added Kamuka, "and maybe they swim it quick." Mr. Brewster's meeting with Serbot resulted in an immediate, though guarded, truce. Mr. Whitman and Jacome moved up to back Mr. Brewster, while Serbot was beckoning for Pepito and Urubu to come and join him. The boys stayed in the background, as did Serbot's bearers, none of whom had been injured in the brief fray. How many headhunters might be lying dead in the brush or limping away wounded, there was no telling, but the battle had been won rapidly and effectively. Serbot seemed duly appreciative as he purred, "We owe you much, amigo. You have helped us. Perhaps there is some way we can help you." "None at all," Mr. Brewster said curtly. "Now that we have driven off the Makus, we can go our separate ways." "But how can you go anywhere? You have no bearers." "They are waiting farther up the main trail with our equipment. We left them while we came back to look for the boys." Serbot promptly raised a new line of inquiry. "Perhaps you are surprised to see me here," he suggested, "so far from Manaus, where we last met." "Why should I be surprised?" returned Mr. Brewster. "We are both looking for balata, aren't we?" "I am not looking for rubber," Serbot declared. "I am looking for a man named Joe Nara, who claims to have a gold mine somewhere near the headwaters of the Rio Negro. He came down to Manaus in a fast boat shortly before you left your hotel." "Who told you I had left?" "The manager at the Hotel Jacares. He also said that your room appeared to have been robbed. The next day your jeep was found near an empty boathouse. I learned that Senor Whitman had started from there on a rubber exploration trip upriver." "And you thought I had joined him?" "Exactly, Senor. So I came by plane to find you." Biff realized that Serbot's plane must have been one of those that had passed over Nara's cruiser on the trip up the Rio Negro. "After I hired Urubu as a guide," continued Serbot, "I learned that you had arrived on Nara's cruiser. So I assumed that you had planned to meet Nara later." "So you bribed Luiz to kill me, to make sure of meeting Nara first?" "No, no, senor. I only wanted Luiz to delay your safari, as Pepito and Urubu will tell you." Serbot gestured to the pair, and Pepito smiled broadly, while Urubu showed his usual ugly grin. "I wanted to talk to Nara," continued Serbot earnestly, "because I had heard that he was willing to sell his gold mine to the highest bidder. That is, if he really has a gold mine. Perhaps you could tell me that." "I wouldn't know," returned Mr. Brewster. "As you say, I am only interested in rubber, and it's time that I was starting off to look for some." With that parting, Mr. Brewster motioned his companions back toward the main trail. They'd only gone a dozen paces when Mr. Brewster undertoned, "Take turns glancing back to see what that crowd is doing. I don't trust any of them, particularly Urubu." Biff took the first look and reported that Urubu, like Serbot and Pepito, was leaning on his gun while the trio apparently discussed what to do next. Soon Kamuka reported the same thing. Then Mr. Whitman looked back and announced that the group was now out of sight. Mr. Brewster called for a quicker pace, and when they reached the main trail, they moved even faster. So fast, in fact, that Biff and Kamuka had to jog along to keep up with the three men. "We came back to look for you at dawn," Biff's father told the boys, "so our bearers will be packed and waiting for us when we reach our last night's campsite. If Serbot pushes his crew to overtake us, they will be worn out, while we'll be starting fresh." Mr. Whitman was feeling the heat, for he removed his white helmet to mop his forehead. "More likely," he said, "Serbot will try to overtake Nara by going up the bank of the Rio Negro. That makes all this hurry useless." "No, we still must keep ahead of Serbot," Mr. Brewster insisted. "If Serbot has guessed where Nara is going, he will move up the Rio Del Moretti while we are coming down it." The bearers were waiting when they reached the campsite and fell promptly into line. There was little difficulty in spurring them on. The mere mention that the Macus were behind them was enough. During the next few days, the bearers toiled steadily along the inland trail. Apparently there was nothing that they feared more than the Macus. Nothing at least until the safari reached a deep but narrow stream that the bearers promptly identified as Rio Del Moretti. Then they broke into a babble of Indian talk that only Jacome was able to translate. "They say they leave us here," declared Jacome. "It is death, they say, to go down this river." Mr. Brewster studied the narrow trail that flanked the riverbank and dwindled off into the thick green of the jungle. "Tell them that if they go back the way they came, they may meet the Macus." Jacome translated Mr. Brewster's comment. The bearers chattered back excitedly, and Jacome announced, "They say they would rather meet Makuu than stay near Rio del Moretti. They say they go home now." While Jacome spoke, the bearers picked up their few belongings and started on their homeward trek. Biff and Kamuka noted that they did not even stop to fill their water bags from the stream that they seemed to dread so much. "What do you make of it, Kamuka?" Biff asked. "I do not know," Kamuka replied. "I cannot even understand the things they say to Jacome, except that they are afraid to go down river." However, the expedition was far from being stranded. The pack bags that the native bearers had abandoned contained 3 rubber boats, complete with aluminum seats and paddles. Biff and Kamuka helped pump them full of air, so they took on a squatty, roundish shape. Then, after a survey of the rubber flotilla, Mr. Brewster decided to take Biff and Kamuka with him in one boat, while Mr. Whitman and Jacome manned the second, each carrying whatever equipment it could bear. The third boat was converted into a raft and loaded with all the remaining packs. Biff's father took it in tow, letting Hal Whitman pace the trip downstream. To Biff, this was a fine change after the long, sweaty hours on the trail when he and Kamuka had helped relieve the bearers. They were floating through a maze of jungle green that at times actually arched into a tunnel above them. Though heavily loaded, the boats moved easily, more swiftly as the jungle banks narrowed and the river itself deepened. Whitman was waving back cheerily as they skimmed off the mileage. Suddenly they saw him rise and wag his paddle frantically as he shouted, "Stay back! Stay back!" His words were drowned by a mighty roar as they turned the bend and saw what Whitman had already viewed. No wonder the natives called this the Rio del Moretti, the River of Death. Just ahead, a curved crest of foam showed where the stream took a sudden drop in the form of a mammoth waterfall. A sheer plunge to doom on the rocks 100 feet below. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Brazilian Gold Mine Mystery by Andy Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Tomlinson. Chapter 14. The Devil's Gateway. "Paddle hard on the right, boys, with all your might." Mr. Brewster shouted the order above the river's tumult, and all three bent to the task. They brought their boat broadside to the approaching brink and drove it towards the left bank of the stream, which here was scarcely 100 feet wide. It was a grueling race against death. There was no escaping the powerful current that seemed to draw them with a suction pull, yet the jungle bank was coming closer with every stroke. They were almost there now, but Biff, in the bow, had no chance to catch the first projecting tree as the boat was swept past it. He worked madly with the paddle instead, for here the bank was eaten away by the current and there was nothing to grab. It seemed certain now that the boat would be carried over the falls, when suddenly it began to swirl about, and another few strokes brought them into the last big clump of overhanging brush. Biff and Kamuka managed to grab hold and cling there while Mr. Brewster worked the boat into the bank itself. Then new disaster loomed in the shape of the pack boat which had been following them in its tow line. As the other boat spun past, its line went taut before Mr. Brewster could cut it. Biff's shoulders seemed to wrench half from their sockets, and he felt the bush pull loose from the soil. Then the tug ended as the other boat came full about, giving them a soft thump. Churned into this new position, it bulked in between the bank and their own craft, almost wedging them loose and out into the stream. Mr. Brewster made a quick leap across the baggage and up on the high bank, carrying the slack line which he hitched over a tree bough. That secured both boats, while the boys clambered ashore. In cutting away the bank, the current had created an eddy which accounted for the final swirl that had carried both boats to safety. Yet only a dozen feet away, the tangled jungle growth actually quivered in the fringe of the falls that dropped in one huge deluge into the dizzy depths below. It was from there that they first looked for Whitman's boat, expecting to see it bobbing somewhere in the rocky gorge 100 feet below. The rising mist obscured the bottom of the falls, where the terrific torrent would by now have battered the bodies of Mr. Whitman and Jacome into a pulp. Or so they thought, until Mr. Brewster stepped closer to the overhanging bushes and gained a full view of the crescent-shaped brink. He beckoned to the boys and exclaimed, "Look there!" Caught between two low rocks, Whitman's boat was jammed on the brink, its two occupants still alive, temporarily at least. Heavily loaded, wide of beam and flexible because of its inflated sides, the rubber boat had snagged where almost any other craft would have cracked up and gone over the crest. Other rocks jutted at close intervals along the foamy brim. Biff noticed them when he saw Mr. Whitman rise in the boat to point them out to Jacome. "Those rocks are like stepping stones, Dad," exclaimed Biff. "If we throw a line to them, maybe we can haul them ashore." An interruption came as the boat wobbled on its precarious perch, due to Mr. Whitman's shift of weight. It settled back again as Whitman plopped down into the stern. From the shore, Biff's father gestured for Whitman to stay down and received a nod in reply. Turning to Biff, Mr. Brewster declared, "Throwing them a line won't help. If they missed their footing, they would be swept away in spite of it. We'll have to carry it across to the other bank and moor it there." From the pack boat, Mr. Brewster produced a coil of thin, strong rope, which he estimated as more than long enough to bridge the stream and return. He looped the center around a tree trunk and gave the ends to Kamuka, motioning him into the empty boat. Then, with Biff helping, Mr. Brewster kept working his way up along the bank, pulling the boat from the shore, while Kamuka nimbly grabbed at passing branches. After they were a safe distance upstream, Mr. Brewster brought Biff into the boat with him and told the boys, "Paddle hard on the left this time. Try to swing the boat upstream, and don't stop, not for one instant." Again they were in the swirl of the swift-flying current where Biff, paddling bow, found it impossible to bring the boat about, even with Kamuka working valiantly to help him. But Mr. Brewster had allowed for that. Their efforts, plus his own, brought them to the far bank, still well above the falls. There, the boys warped the boat downstream, while Biff's father hauled in the floating rope. Picking a landing spot, they carried one end of the rope about a tree, where they drew it taut and tied it to the other end. The rope now followed the slight curve of the cataract's brim from the opposite bank as far as Whitman's stranded boat. Mr. Brewster then took a loop of rope around a paddle and began to twist it, winch fashion. He let the boys take over, one at each end of the paddle, while he waved to the boat and pointed to the water. Whitman and Jacome understood the plan at once and caught on to the rope as it emerged. Rapidly, the boys turned the paddle, tightening the rope until it looked like a suspension cable, except for its outward curve. Mr. Whitman and Jacome, rising gradually from the boat, gripped the center of the double line. Jacome took to the stepping stones first, moving in limber, cat-like fashion as he left the boat. Mr. Whitman, who had settled low to offset the loss in weight, watched every move, still clutching the center of the rope, which also helped to steady the boat. Hand over hand, Jacome followed the rope, swinging from one projecting rock to the next, or actually leaping a space where the water gushed through. It became easier as Jacome neared the bank where the pack boat was moored. There, Jacome swung on the shore and waved for Whitman to follow. As before, Whitman rose too rapidly. This time the boat skidded out from under him. As it did, he hopped to the nearest rock and balanced there by clinging to the rope. Biff saw the boat slide over the falls, tumbling from sight with the light luggage it contained. Breathlessly, Biff watched Hal Whitman swing to the next broad stone, where he swayed dangerously while Mr. Brewster and Jacome, tightening their ends of the rope, helped to steady him. What had been child's play for Jacome would have meant disaster for Whitman without that timely aid. The last leap, that looked the easiest, was the most dangerous of all. Where Jacome had swung himself clear up on the bank, Whitman dropped short, but not into the sweeping current that fringed the shore. Jacome had wisely edged the pack boat into the gap. Whitman landed on the luggage, and then Jacome pulled him up to the bank above. During the next few hours, the party worked its way down the steep walls that flanked the waterfall. This might have been impossible except for the holds afforded by the heavy jungle growth. The boats were deflated and lowered by ropes. Then, when Biff and Kamuka reached the gorge, they found a shallow stretch where they waded and swam the river to receive the luggage from the pack boat that Mr. Whitman and Jacome lowered from their side. Farther downstream, the boys found Whitman's boat still intact, along with its baggage, which Jacome had tied inside the rubber craft before abandoning it. Biff and Kamuka hauled it ashore and spread the contents of the bag so they could dry. That night, they camped within sound of the big waterfall, and the muffled roar seemed almost musical, now that its hazard had been passed. But Hal Whitman, seated by the campfire, spoke bitterly about his harrowing experience. "I blame Joe Nara for all this," he declared. "I believe he is our real enemy, not Nicholas Serbot." "How do you figure that, Hal?" inquired Mr. Brewster. "First, Nara must have snooped a lot more than he let on," argued Whitman, "in order to learn about the boathouse down in Manus. Am I right?" "You may be right," conceded Mr. Brewster. "Go on." "And by checking on me," continued Whitman, "he found out about you. He learned that you were staying at the Hotel Jacares, so he sent one of his Indians to steal your map." "Wait, Hal," interposed Mr. Brewster with a smile. "How could he have known that I even had the map?" "He knew Lew Kirby made a deal with somebody. You were the logical man, or you wouldn't have gone to all the trouble and expense of sending me up to Santa Isabel to organize a safari." "But if Nara knew I had the map, why would he want to steal it? Lew Kirby was his partner, remember?" "I remember." Mr. Whitman smiled grimly. "What's more, so does Joe Nara. And that's probably the one thing he'd like most to forget. So he wouldn't be bound by any deal that Kirby made." "Exactly. Without the map, you haven't any claim. If Kirby signed over his share of the mine to you, you would need the map to prove it." "I still have part of it, Hal." "Yes," acknowledged Whitman, "but I'll bet that Joe Nara only let you keep it because he decided it wouldn't do you any good. Think it over, and you'll see I'm right." Whether or not Mr. Brewster thought it over during the night, Biff certainly did. When they were loading the boats at dawn to resume their trip downriver, Biff asked his father, "Do you think that Mr. Whitman is right about Joe Nara?" "There may be something in what he says," admitted Mr. Brewster. "Nara may have been keeping something from us." During the day, they made speedy progress down the river, hugging the bank at every bend to avoid new waterfalls. But the trip proved smooth, which only brought more grumbles from Whitman. "Nara sent us down this river to get rid of us," he declared, as they paddled along. "It wasn't his fault that the Rio Del Moretti failed to live up to its name. As for that gateway where we're supposed to meet him, El Porto del Diablo, I don't think there is such a place." 1 hour later, those doubts were dispelled. As the boats passed a bend, they came to an opening in the jungle that looked like the dry bed of a stream that had once joined the Rio del Moretti. Then amid the thick green foliage loomed the very rock that Nara had mentioned, split like a huge gateway a short distance up the ravine. They pulled the boats up on the low, sandy shore, where Mr. Brewster decided to leave the packs and other equipment, though not for long. "Nara said to come through the gateway," he said, "and meet him somewhere up the ravine. If we don't see him soon, we can come back and bring the luggage in relays." The trail narrowed at the end of half a mile and veered sharply beneath a high, bulging cliff that slanted back like a gigantic brow, cutting off the sunlight. Mr. Brewster, well in advance, had reached the turn in the ravine, when Jacome, bringing up the rear of the procession, gave a loud, warning shout. The rest looked up in time to see the tiny, squatty figures of 6 men drop suddenly behind a row of rocks that resembled the top edge of a castle tower. But that impression was a brief one. As the group stared from below, they saw the rocky summit topple forward. Those watchers on the cliff top had launched a mass of bounding boulders that encountered bigger chunks of granite and carried them along, with the earth in which they were embedded. An avalanche of stone and dirt was gaining size as it roared down the slope, threatening to block the narrow ravine and bury every member of the party that had come into its path. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Brazilian Gold Mine Mystery by Andy Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Tomlinson. Chapter 15, Fabulous Eldorado. While the others stood rooted, staring upward, Biff looked for his father, in the frantic hope of giving him some last-moment warning. Up ahead, Mr. Brewster was waving for them to join him. Biff grabbed Whitman by the arm and tried to start him forward, at the same time yelling to Kamuka and Jacome. "It's our only chance. Maybe Dad can get us past the turn in the ravine." They all were starting forward before Biff finished speaking, but their chance faded as the landslide's roar increased, spreading as it came over the cliff edge. The first wave of dirt and stone was not only peppering them, it was pouring into the side passage that seemed their only refuge. Fortunately, none of them was hit by that first spray of smaller stones. Whitman stumbled, but Jacome overtook him and helped him regain his footing. Then they had reached Mr. Brewster, who was blocking them from the side passage where Biff thought he wanted them to go. Instead, Biff's father now was rushing them beneath the overhanging cliff, where they huddled against the rocky wall and turned to witness the havoc that they had so narrowly escaped. From this hollow, open space where Mr. Brewster had guided them, they watched tons of dirt and stone drop down in a solid curtain only a dozen feet away, for the bulge of the cliff above was comparatively slight. Yet it jutted enough to send the tremendous landslide cascading out beyond them, something on which Mr. Brewster had counted when he made his quick decision. But after the roar had finally subsided, Biff's father disclaimed any special credit for the rescue. "I was close enough to see that this pocket offered us our only chance," stated Mr. Brewster. "As it was, your own prompt response saved your lives. Otherwise, you would now be under there." Mr. Brewster gestured significantly to the mound of earth and rock that had piled many feet above their heads. Carefully, they worked their way up over it and down a long slant to the main ravine, which they followed back to the river. On the way, they looked up to the brow of the great cliff, but saw no human figures there. They noted, though, that the landslide had turned the ravine into a dead end, with no trace of the narrow passage that angled off to the right, the route that they would have taken. Back at the river, Biff's father sat on a pack and commented rather ruefully, "I guess this about ends our quest for Eldorado." "I'm afraid so," Whitman agreed. "I've told you all along that Joe Nara was a phony." "You mentioned a few reasons why you thought so," reminded Mr. Brewster, "but they were hardly sufficient, Hal." "All right," retorted Whitman. "I'll add a few clinchers. Nara said his men were Wai Indians, didn't he?" "That's right." "Well, the Wais come from clear over in British Guiana, not from around here. And you remember those shrunken heads he showed us, to prove that Macus were around?" Mr. Brewster nodded. "Those were Jivaro heads," declared Whitman, "from somewhere up the Amazon itself. Macus don't shrink heads. All Nara wanted was to scare our bearers back to Santa Isabel and chase us off into the jungle. Right now, he's probably still down on the Rio Negro, making a deal with Serbot, somewhere near Piedra del Cuchai, learning what the competition has to offer." Whitman cut off, his mouth wide open as he looked downstream. The others turned and saw a dugout canoe approaching, with Joe Nara reclining comfortably against the pack bags in its center, while Igo and Ubu were paddling him up the Rio Del Moretti. Old Joe was smiling as he stepped ashore, but he became solemn when he saw the accusing eyes that were fixed upon him. "I don't wonder you're annoyed," apologized Nara. "I should have gotten here first." "You didn't expect us to get here at all," Hal Whitman broke in. "Those directions of yours were a one-way ticket over the falls on the Rio del Moretti." "You tried to come down the river by boat?" Nara paused and stared at the rubber boats. "I didn't know you had these with you. I said to follow the river, that was all. Remember?" "I remember," returned Mr. Brewster. "You also told us to go up through the gateway to the ravine." "No, I didn't," interrupted Nara. "I said for you to come up through." "What would be the difference?" "Well, if you came up through," explained Nara, "I would have been there to meet you. But if you had gone up through ahead of me—" He shook his head. "Well, thank heavens you didn't try it." "Why not?" "Because the tribe that guards Eldorado would have let loose a landslide if they saw strangers coming their way. I was mighty glad to find you waiting here. I knew you couldn't have gone up through El Porto del Diablo." "But we did go up through." As Joe Nara stared incredulously, Mr. Brewster described all that had happened. "Now that the ravine is blocked," he finished, "I suppose you can't take us to your fabulous Eldorado." "On the contrary," returned Nara with a quick smile, "I can take you to the mine by the short way." He spoke to Igo and Ubi in dialect. Then, as the Indians went to the split rock, Nara announced, "I told them to summon some bearers." Igo and Ubi shouted up through the ravine, and their calls seemed to echo back. Soon, squatty Indians appeared from the Devil's Gateway, until a dozen of them had lined silently in front of Joe Nara. Kamuka undertoned to Biff, "These are the men who pushed the stones from hill." "I figured that," said Biff. "I wonder whether they are surprised or sorry to see us still alive." "They are neither. They think Nara has made us live again because we are his friends. They think Nara is Eldorado." From the furtive glances that the squatty Indians gave toward the Brewster party, along with the way they were awaiting Nara's bidding, Biff decided that Kamuka had guessed right. At Nara's command, the Indians did the unexpected. They began replacing the packs and other equipment in the rubber boats, while Nara suggested that Mr. Brewster and his party get on board. Then the Indians brought dugouts from the bushes, and soon they were all paddling up the Rio del Moretti, with Nara's canoe in the lead. The going was easy, for the current was sluggish here. After about 2 miles, Igo and Ubi drove Nara's dugout to a low bank where the jungle appeared to be the thickest. With their paddles, they raised a tangle of roots as they would a curtain and worked the boat through. The others followed into a channel wide enough to accommodate the rubber boats with ease. When the foliage had been dropped behind the final canoe, Biff looked back and saw that the mouth of this stream was as completely hidden as before. They emerged from the jungle near a towering rock that looked like the one from which the Indians had launched the landslide. They pulled up the boats beside the stream and took to a steep trail that brought them up behind the rock, past the far end of the block ravine. The trail climbed steadily with more slopes rising ahead. Beyond them were mountain peaks, some looming blue and cloud-capped in the distance, overlooking a vast, unexplored region. The chunky bearers marched steadily onward, crossing logs over deep ravines and following ledges hewn into the mountainsides. Biff kept his eyes fixed on the backs of the trudging Indians to avoid any dizziness from looking below. "We are now in the Parima Mountains," Joe Nara told them. "This part of the range is in Venezuela." "I know," acknowledged Mr. Brewster. "We crossed the border from Brazil soon after we left Piedra del Cruchay." "What about these Indians of yours?" Hal Whitman put in. "You say they are Waways, Nara, but that tribe lives over in Guyana." "The main tribe does," returned Nara, "but this one group remained here to guard the sacred mountain where Eldorado is located. They believed that Dai Pururi, the spirit of evil, would go on a rampage if anyone found the mine." "And how did you get around that?" "I figured out a trick," chuckled Nara, "that made them think I was Eldorado himself, the original Golden Boy in person. So they took Lew Kirby and me up to the mine, the same way they're going now." Single file, the Wayways were climbing steps cut in a cliff, gripping liana vines as handrails to balance the weight of their packs. As Biff began the climb, the bearers looked like big, bulging beetles crawling toward the skyline. One by one, they dropped from sight, as did the others in the party. Biff learned the reason when he reached a slanted ledge like a niche hacked in the cliff, and found the Wayways squatting there. Kamuka came just behind Biff, then others of the party, and finally Joe Nara. Evidently, the Wayways were awaiting him, for they began an odd chant that included the words "Eldorado, Eldorado," and continued as the shock-haired prospector strode past them. Nara paused where the ledge burrowed at a slant into the cliff, and beckoned for everyone to follow, which they did. Then they entered a gloomy mine shaft so low that all members of the party had to stoop, except the boys. The Wayway bearers, already bending under their burdens, followed the route automatically as though the passage had been cut to their size. Daylight showed where the shaft opened into a great cavern. There the sun shone through cracks and other openings in the ceiling. It glinted on chunky rock walls that fairly burned with vivid golden yellow. All the tales that Biff had ever heard of hidden treasure had suddenly become real. This was a wonderland of wealth, with glittering side shafts going deeper into the mountain, promising new finds for anyone who followed them. Kamuka, awed by the yellow glitter, asked in breathless tone, "How much you think this worth, Biff? 1,000,000 cruzeiro, maybe?" "A lot more if it's gold ore," returned Biff. "But it's worth practically nothing if it is simply yellow quartz. A lot of that is found in Brazil, in places easier to reach than this. What's just as bad, it may be fool's gold." "Fool gold? What is that?" "A mineral called pyrite," exclaimed Biff. "Usually iron mixed with sulfur. It often fools people who think that it is gold. But it is more the color of brass than gold, and it leaves a green streak when you rub it on something smooth." As Biff picked up a chunk of yellow rock to examine it, he caught a nod of approval from his father. Biff had repeated facts that Mr. Brewster had told him regarding metals. Now Biff's father indicated a stretch of rocky wall, where patches of yellow shone from a background of milky white. He asked, "What do you make of this, Biff?" "It looks like gold quartz for sure, Dad," exclaimed Biff. "There's no chance of mistaking that." Or is there? In this case, there is no mistake. Mr. Brewster was studying the milky quartz as he spoke. Undoubtedly, this shaft was first mined centuries ago, for it resembles old Indian mines that I have inspected. But although it yielded gold years ago, I doubt that its wealth has ever begun to be tapped. You're right about that, chuckled Joe Nara, who was standing by. Look there, and there, and there. Nara had turned on a powerful flashlight, and with each announcement, he pointed its beam down another rough-hewn shaft that branched from the main corridor. Each time, the glare was reflected with a new burst of brilliance. The gold of Eldorado, boasted Nara. A mountain full of it, and a lot more that cropped over, as I'll show you. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of Brazilian Gold Mine Mystery by Andy Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Tomlinson. Chapter 16. Surrounded. From the great central room, Joe Nara led his companions down through a maze of shafts and tunnels. Each passage joined with another, and frequently the links were steep steps worn smooth by the feet of native miners hundreds of years before. At intervals, daylight showed through the shafts that had been driven down through the mountain to tap a vein of gold. Always, the passages led finally into new corridors that glittered with rich ore. At last, a long straight tunnel brought the party out on the far side of the mountain, hundreds of feet below the starting level. The slope was gradual here, featured by dirt gullies leading down to a grassy valley with the jungle beyond. As they followed the bed of one dry stream, Joe Nara pointed to the sparkle in its sands. "That's where I've picked up some of these," he chuckled, bringing some small gold nuggets from his pocket and displaying them in his open hand. "But mostly I find them up some of the smaller stream beds. The gold just kind of oozes out of the mountain." Near the bottom of the slope was a shallow depression that nestled like a bowl in the curve of the mountainside. "That's where the lake was," declared Nara. "The lake where Eldorado used to take a dip and come out all covered with gold. It's dried up now, but there's still plenty of gold down in those sands." Mr. Brewster studied the lake bed carefully. Biff saw his father look beyond, as though following a sandy course that led down to the grassy area that fringed the jungle. "You are probably right," Mr. Brewster told Nara. "The lake was artificially formed, and once the dam was broken, the water found its way down into the jungle." "And it joined a stream there," added Nara, "as I'll show you. Do you know why this all happened?" Tilting his head, he darted one of his bird-like glances at Whitman, then back to Mr. Brewster. "I'll tell you why. When the Indians found that the Spaniards and the English were going after Eldorado as well as after each other, they closed up shop. That's what they did, just closed up shop. They busted the dam and got rid of the lake so nobody could find it. They covered over all the shafts so that nobody could find them either. They started rumors about Eldorado being somewhere else to send all the explorers on a wild goose chase. Then they kept guard over the real Eldorado to scare away anybody who stumbled on it by mistake." "All quite logical," agreed Mr. Brewster. "That is the way the Indians would act." He turned to Whitman and asked, "You agree, don't you, Hal?" "I agree," nodded Whitman. "Now, I know why Nara showed us those shrunken heads. He did want to scare our bearers so they would run back to Santa Isabel. But it was because his ways would have made trouble if we brought a strange tribe here." "They made trouble enough as it was," declared Nara with a dry chuckle. Then, turning to Mr. Brewster, he said, "Let's see what's left of that map Lou Kirby gave you. Then we can figure out what to do next." Mr. Brewster produced the torn corner from the map. It showed the mine, the stream bed, the lake, and the trail that continued into the jungle, where it reached a river that was marked on the map. "The route is an easy one," stated Nara. "As you can see, But first I want you to estimate the value of the mine. Then pick out the ore you want, so we can take it to the river. From there we will go downstream to the Casiquiare Canal and work our way through to the Orinoco River." They camped that night beneath the trees that fringed the jungle. The next day Mr. Brewster returned to the mine and studied it in detail. They stayed in the same camp another night, and on the following day the Indians brought down loads of ore that Mr. Brewster had selected. Those loads were carried several miles through the jungle to the river that Nara had mentioned. Biff and Kamuka helped make a new camp there. Then they swam in the river while they waited for the Indians to bring the packs. The water was very clear, and the boys brought up handfuls of glittering sand from the bottom. When Mr. Brewster saw it, he commented, "There's a fortune in gold to be dredged from this stream, but we still have the problem of getting it down the Orinoco." Joe Nara had the answer to that problem. His Indians showed up with a small flotilla of odd-looking craft that resembled the monterias of the Amazon. Nearly 30 feet long, each boat had an open cockpit at the front with a thatched cupola at the stern, serving as a sort of cabin. Nara's boats were different, however, from the more antiquated river craft. His boats were low in the stern, so that the big steering paddle could be replaced by a sizable outboard motor. Nara had such motors and the gasoline to fuel them. "Every trip I make downriver," explained Nara, "either over the mountain and down the Rio Negro or down this stream to the Orinoco, I bought motors and gasoline and brought them back here. I knew that someday Lew Kirby would talk some company into a big deal for our mine. What's more, I knew the first thing they would ask would be if they could transport either the gold or the ore once they mined it. My answer is yes, and I've got the boats to prove it. And the motors too. I've kept them for a long time." Judging by the appearance of the motors, that was true. Some were 20 years old, but all proved serviceable when attached to the loaded boats. The 4 boats that formed the strange flotilla started out at a slow but steady speed down the narrow jungle river that marked the first stage of a long, adventurous journey. Each boat carried a crew of 3. Biff and Kamuka were in one boat with Mr. Brewster. Jacome and a Wai Indian were in another with Hal Whitman. The 3rd boat was Nara's, with Ego and Ubi as its crew. The 4th, which served as a kitchen boat and carried the food supply, was manned by 3 Wai tribesmen. The packs, which included tents and other equipment, were in the boats commanded by Mr. Brewster and Mr. Whitman. The ore from the mine was mostly in Nara's boat, which squatted lower in the water due to its added weight. But it maintained the same speed as the other craft for the simple but sufficient reason that Nara had equipped it with the largest of his old model motors. The containers of gasoline were distributed among the boats, and all were careful not to waste any of the precious fuel. At times they used the oars or let the current carry them. When they encountered channels that were narrow or shallow, they poled the boats through. They were deep in the jungle when the river opened into a fair-sized lake, where Nara pulled his boat alongside of Mr. Brewster's to check the map again. "This is one of the lagoons that connects with the Casiquiare Canal," explained Nara. "Actually, the Casiquiare is an overflow from the Orinoco that reaches the headwaters of the Rio Negro, forming a link with the Amazon. But sometimes the canal backs up and flows the wrong way. The important thing is that it is always navigable, clear to the Orinoco." The job now was to work from one lagoon to another, through channels that would have been shown on the missing portion of Kirby's map. Nara knew the route from memory, and fortunately he had been over it several times. But he still had trouble picking his way through a lot of lesser channels, and at times he called upon Mr. Brewster to check the course by compass. "Taking a boat through a jungle," declared Nara, "is just like going for a hike in the woods. First thing you know, you're traveling in a circle. Only you don't ever really know it, because wherever you are, it always looks the same." The more Biff thought that over, the more true it seemed, but when he discussed it with Kamuka, the Indian boy disputed the notion. "One place is not like another," declared Kamuka. "I look there and I see so many trees. I remember them like picture. You show me another place, the picture is different." "In that case," said Biff, "I suppose you could never get lost in the jungle." "I get lost easy," returned Kamuka. "Too easy. Any place I do not know, I am lost, maybe. but I never get lost in the same place where I was before." Biff decided to test that out in a simple but effective way. As they chugged along, he made notes of certain spots and told Kamuka to remember them on his own. When they reached a similar place, Biff asked Kamuka to tell him the difference. Always, Kamuka came up with some slight variation that tallied with Biff's list. When they swung into a small cove past a jutting point with an odd overhanging tree, Biff was sure that they had seen the place before. This time, Kamuka couldn't come up with enough differences in the scenery. Triumphantly, Biff was saying, "You see, Kamuka, this could be the same place where we were an hour ago, or even like it, so you can't tell the difference." "Except," said Kamuka, "that there was no smoke in trees, no campfire with people around, no boats coming out from shore." Biff looked up in surprise. He saw more boats, a whole batch of them, shooting out from opposite points to block off any retreat. More than a dozen in number, those boats were filled with natives who shouted savage war cries as they closed in on Nara's flotilla, forcing the heavier boats towards the shore. There was no avoiding the camp where warlike natives waited, armed with spears, for now other canoes were darting out from hiding places to complete the rapid roundup. Rather than be boarded by the natives, Mr. Brewster ordered the boats to the shore. There, he and Whitman sprang out with loaded rifles. Biff and Kamuka followed, bringing their machetes. Jacome joined them, armed in the same fashion. Immediately they were surrounded by a dozen silent natives who stood ready with poised spears. "Be careful," warned Jacome. "Do not make move. Big pot on fire is used to cook curare. Spear point poison, maybe." Between the circling natives, Biff saw the fire and the pot that Jacome mentioned. It was a big crude kettle, steaming over the log flames. "I'm glad they're just cooking curare," Biff whispered to Kamuka. "I thought maybe they were boiling some special stuff to shrink our heads." "Maybe they do just that," returned Kamuka solemnly. "I do not like this. Not one bit, Biff." A tall chief with a drooping feathered headdress and a plume belt had taken charge, and was ordering Nara and the Waiways from their boats. Nara's Indians brought their machetes, but old Joe came entirely unarmed. He jabbered dialect at the feathered chief. Then, finding that he didn't understand, Nara let Ego and Ubi take over as interpreters. After a brief talk, Nara turned to Mr. Brewster. "They are Makuu Indians," stated Nara. "They were told that we intend to attack their village." "Makus," Biff's father groaned. "I knew they would catch up with us." "Not Makus," corrected Nara. "Makos, who live on the upper Orinoco. But they can be just as dangerous, now that they're sure we are their enemies." "Where did they get that idea?" asked Mr. Brewster. "From 3 men who stopped at their village near the Cassiquiare," explained Nara, "and told them that we would come sneaking through the backwaters to the spot where we are now." "Serbot, Pepito, and Yorubu," Mr. Brewster decided grimly. "It must have been Pepito who stole the map in Manus. They were unable to locate the mine on their portion of it, but they cut across our route and stirred up this tribe against us." "What do we do now?" put in Whitman. "Give them presents and send them away happy?" "They won't be happy unless they take us too," declared Nara. "They want us to accompany them to their village, so that their king can hear our story. He will decide whether we are guilty or innocent." "That means he will either find us guilty," observed Mr. Brewster, "or he will put us through some ordeal where we will come out more dead than alive. Should we make a stand for it here?" "Not a chance," returned Nara. "Those spear tips are already poisoned. That's why they're boiling water, to cook up a new brew after they've used their spears. One false move now, and we're goners." From the bristling appearance of the spears and the glares of the 24 spearmen who now surrounded the party, it looked as though Nara was right. Impatient mutters were coming from the tribesmen, while the feathered chief awaited a reply. "We can't fight them," declared Mr. Brewster, "and we can't go with them. What choice does that leave us?" "Only one," replied Nara calmly. "We must convince them that we have a right to be here, more right, in fact, than they have." He turned to Ubi and Ego and announced importantly, "Tell them who I am." Ego and Ubi babbled in dialect with the title Eldorado sprinkled through it, bringing echoing exclamations of Eldorado from the Makuu tribesmen. At the finish, Ego spoke simply to Nara. "They say they like to see you show them." "I'll show them." Nara made a spreading gesture with his arms. "Tell them to clear the way to that big pot up there by the fire, and I'll show them I'm Eldorado." As Ego translated the statement, the Makuu chief ordered his followers to clear a path, which they did. Old Joe Nara strode forward, nodding his head as though his triumph was already assured. "I hope," said Kamuka, "that Senor Nara can do something to help, like real Eldorado would." "Whatever he does," added Biff fervently, "it will have to be good, if it's going to help at all." End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of Brazilian Gold Mine Mystery by Andy Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Tomlinson. Chapter 17, The Man of Gold. When Joe Nara reached the big campfire, he extended his hands above the simmering kettle and swept them back and forth in slow, impressive fashion. His back was toward the half-circle of tribesmen, but now he changed position. First to the right, then to the left of the fire, Nara repeated his odd ritual. Finally, he stepped beyond the fire and turned to face the group through the rising steam which wavered and curled about his arms as he repeated his ceremony. Two savage spearmen had stepped up to flank him with poised weapons, but Nara paid them no attention. Biff looked slowly around and saw that he and his father were under similar guard. So were Kamuka and Hal Whitman, as well as Jacome and the other natives. Whatever Nara might do, there would be no chance to make a run for the boats. Now Nara was drawing his shirt sleeves clear up past his elbows. He looked like a wizened wizard as he showed one bare arm and then the other, holding his upraised hands with widespread fingers. Looking toward the sun, which was almost overhead, Nara made a clutching motion with his right hand, then a downward throw toward the kettle, as though flinging blobs of sunlight into the bubbling liquid. Then he boldly drove his right arm, shoulder deep, into the kettle, keeping it there while he stirred the boiling water with his bare arm. The tribesmen began an excited babble when they realized that Nara was unharmed. It became a shout when Nara brought his hand from the kettle and raised it high for all to see. From fingertips to above his elbow, Nara's hand and arm glittered like burnished gold, catching the sparkle of the sunlight which he had seemingly captured to transform his flesh into that precious metal. Now the tribesmen were shouting recognition. "Eldorado! Eldorado!" Nara apparently had turned legend into fact. To prove his power, he repeated the process with his left arm. He showed it bare and white, dipped it deep into the hissing water, and brought it out all golden like his right. The cry of Eldorado, Eldorado increased as Nara stalked among the Makuu tribesmen, showing them his hands and arms at close range. The warriors were awed, from their chief down to the pair of spearmen who were supposed to keep Nara a prisoner, something which they had now forgotten in their amazement. The Wai Wais remained silent. Ego, Ubi, and Nara's other followers had seen him perform this wonder. They took his power for granted. Now, at a word from Nara, Ego and Ubi gathered up small pebbles which they showed to the Makuu tribesmen. Nara went back to the big kettle, and there he took pebbles, first from Ego, then from Ubi, promptly dipping them in the bubbling brew. As he brought out the pebbles, he held them in the sunlight, showing them to be pure gold. Nara gave the magic stones to Ego and Ubi to distribute among the Makuu warriors, who crowded forward to receive the gifts. Biff found himself practically alone beside his father. In an awed tone, Biff asked, "How did Nara work that trick, Dad?" "He stirred the water to reduce its temperature," explained Mr. Brewster. It had begun to boil at the top, but was still cool below. I've seen the Fiji Islanders do a similar stunt. But how did he turn his hands and arms all golden? With some dye, probably, that he dropped into the water while he was making passes over it. I still can't see how he managed to fool those natives into thinking that those colored pebbles are real gold. They are real gold, Biff's father stated with a smile. Remember all those nuggets that Nara carries? I think he has been palming them from his pockets. Every time he dips a pebble into the kettle, he lets it drop and brings out a nugget instead. Biff watched Nara give the dip treatment to a few more pebbles, then nodded. I think you're right, Dad, said Biff, but Nara is mighty clever at it. Only why is he handing out so many nuggets? To buy our freedom, son, returned Mr. Brewster. Look, Nara is bargaining with the chief right now. The nuggets apparently weren't enough, for the Makuu chief was shaking his head emphatically. Nara promptly came up with a much bigger offer. He picked some stones the size of hen's eggs and began passing them among the tribesmen, who nodded eagerly. Nara can't possibly be carrying nuggets the size of those stones, declared Mr. Brewster. They'd weigh him down so he couldn't walk. Get ready now to run for it. Biff passed the word to Kamuka, who relayed it to Whitman. By then, the Makuu chief had accepted the ransom offer, but wanted the big stones turned to gold. Nara went to the kettle, pretended to throw in more fistfuls of sunlight, then turned to the chief and made a beckoning gesture as he cackled, "Come and get it!" Headed by the chief, the tribesmen made a charge for the magic kettle, all anxious to turn their stones into gold before the pot ran out of concentrated sunlight. Nara stepped away to let them pass, then waved for Mr. Brewster and the rest to begin their own dash the opposite way. They raced for the boats and were clambering on board with Nara only a few yards behind them when the milling tribesmen noticed their flight. Still, the natives were too busy to be bothered until they found that the stones refused to turn to gold. Then they threw them down and grabbed up their spears instead. But by that time the motors were spinning and the boats were underway, with Ego hauling Nara over the side of their monteria while Ubi handled the helm. Some of the natives started a pursuit in their canoes, but the outboards soon outdistanced them. All seemed safe and serene during the next half hour, while they followed deep through the sometimes narrow channels. Then, from far in the jungle behind them, came the bom, bom, bom of a savage drum. Nara signaled for the boats to draw together for a conference. In a worried tone, old Joe announced, "Makuu drums. You can hear them for 30 or 40 miles. They are telling other tribes to be on the watch for us, so be ready for trouble." He paused, then asked Mr. Brewster in a low, confidential tone, "How did you like the golden arm trick?" "Very good," replied Mr. Brewster, "but these natives use paints themselves to color their faces and bodies, so I can't understand how you fooled them with a dye." Biff was close enough to hear Nara's chuckle. "I didn't use dye," Nara stated. "I used a fine powder made from dried plants, sprinkled with tiny flakes of gilt, that spreads on the water like a dust. Dip your hand in and bring it out. The stuff gathers and clings like a snug rubber glove. After it dries, you wipe it off." Nara showed his hands, now perfectly clean, then added, "I sprinkled just about enough for myself, so those Indians didn't get any on their own hands. They still think that I alone have the golden touch, but even my being Eldorado won't help us now that they feel I robbed them." An hour later, the drums were still throbbing when Joe Nara pointed above the jungle to a huge, flat-topped mountain that towered like a mighty mesa above the wavy green. "Crawdads," called Nara from his boat. "One of the biggest mountains in the Parima chain, about 1.5 miles high. It was a long time before anybody climbed it, because the Indians are afraid to go with them, on account of the spirits they think live on top. It's kind of tied in with the Eldorado story. Anyway, Crawdads is close to the Orinoco River." Nara broke off as some canoes came scooting from the canal banks, filled with armed natives. Motors were open to the full, and the flotilla again outdistanced the native dugouts. But Biff, at the bow of his father's monteria, saw new problems ahead. "We've missed the main channel, Dad," Biff called to the stern. "It's shallow ahead, with a lot of sandbars." Mr. Brewster cut off his motor and signaled for the other boats to do the same. "We'd better pole our way through," he decided.
We still have time before those natives catch up with us, and we can't risk getting stranded on a sandbar." "Watch where you push pole," Kamuka advised Biff. "Big sucuria may wrap around it." As Kamuka pointed, Biff saw a huge anaconda lazily sunning itself on a sandbar near the canal bank. Beyond that were others. In fact, the area was alive with the giant snakes, though none appeared to be active. Carefully, the boats were poled through the channels without disturbing the basking boas. Biff looked back and counted a dozen of them still in repose. Snakes as well as shallows had been avoided. When Nara's boat ran on a hidden sandbar that the others had crossed, with its heavy cargo of ore, Nara's monteria refused to budge. Mr. Brewster attached lines to Nara's boat so that the others could haul it free. He told everybody to pole at once, and his plan seemed certain of success when Nara shrilled, "Look back there!" Native canoes had come around the bend. Seeing the flotilla stuck among the sandbars, the tribesmen increased their paddle strokes. Nara grabbed a rifle and shouted to Mr. Brewster, "Get your boats clear, I'll fight them off." "Keep going," ordered Mr. Brewster. Then to Nara he called, "Don't start shooting. They outnumber us 10-1, and those spears of theirs have poison tips. Once they start throwing them, we won't have a chance." It was too late. Joe Nara couldn't be stopped once his mind was made up. He opened fire at the canoes when they reached the first sandbar. 24 warriors rose to fling their deadly spears. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18, A Brazilian Gold Mine Mystery by Andy Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Tomlinson. Chapter 18, Yorubu Again. With the first crackle of Nara's rifle, Mr. Brewster shouted, "Down, everybody, and get ready for them." That, Biff knew, could be more than just a shower of spears. The warriors themselves would be arriving next with other weapons. The only hope would be a few more pole thrusts. But while that might save some of the party, it wouldn't help Joe Nara. It happened, though, that Nara had helped himself. Those crazy shots that peppered the sandbars without coming near a canoe unleashed a terrific force that took the native warriors by complete surprise. As they poised their spears, the sandbank sprang into life before their eyes. Roused by the blast of Nara's guns and the ping of the bullets in their sandy sunning spot, the anacondas lashed their way straight downstream in a broad horde of writhing fury that seemed to stretch like a monstrous ribbon 200 feet in length. The stampede of mighty boa constrictors swept everything from their path. Their thick bodies and lashing coils spilled the canoes and plunged the native warriors into the canal, spears and all. The snakes didn't stop their mad rush. They whacked natives as well as boats when they passed them and left the canoes drifting in a churn of foam that made the canal look like a rapids clear beyond the bend. Then the living tidal wave was gone as quickly as it had begun. But Mr. Brewster wasn't waiting for the natives to reclaim their canoes and spears so as to return to action. "Back to the poles," he ordered. "Heave away, away, everybody. And you too, Nara." Old Joe, his face gleaming in happy surprise at the thing he had touched off, now laid aside his rifle and helped pry the barge from its sandy perch. By the time the hostile tribesmen were wading up on the sandbars that the anacondas had left, Nara's boat was free. Outboards roared anew as the flotilla plowed its way to the main channel and on to the junction of the Casquieri and the Orinoco, where they headed downstream. The rhythmic beat of distant tom-toms could still be heard that evening when the motors were stopped and the boats allowed to drift down the river under a brilliant tropical moon. By morning, the drums had ceased, indicating that the Makuu tribe had either given up the chase or that the flotilla was beyond the danger zone. From then on, the expedition traveled mostly by day and picked suitable campsites overnight. Biff and Kamuka fished frequently and replenished the food supply by catching huge river turtles, as well as a tasty species of catfish called cajaro. Biff landed one that measured well over 3 feet in length.
Some nights, the boats were lashed side by side and moored near river settlements, where they formed what Hal Whitman termed a floating mansion, complete to the kitchen. At one village, Joe Nara bought stacks of huge cassava cakes. These measured 2.5 feet across, but were only a half-inch thick. They had been brought upriver, wrapped in plantain leaves. These formed the main food for the Weiways accompanying Nara, and Jacome and Kamuka liked them too, though Biff found them rather tasteless. In contrast were some caiman eggs, which the boys dug up on a sandy shore while hunting turtles with Jacome. The Indians, Kamuka included, found them tasty indeed, but they were too strong in flavor to suit Biff. Caimans were the great menace of the Orinoco, so the boys were duly warned against them. Closely resembling alligators, they were supposed to measure 25 feet or more in length. But when Kamuka called, "There's a big one," and Mr. Brewster promptly drilled it with a rifle shot, the caiman measured only 12 feet when it was hauled on board the Kitchen Monteria. "When you see a creature in motion," Mr. Brewster told the boys, "and particularly a bird, or its cousin, a reptile, you always gain an exaggerated idea of its length." "Exaggerate?" Kamuka repeated the unfamiliar term. "You mean eggs look too long too?" "Not exactly," put in Biff with a smile. "But if we'd looked much longer at those caiman eggs, they would have hatched." Mr. Brewster smiled at the jokes, then became serious. "You must learn what it means to gauge speed in terms of distance," he declared. "When we reach the rapids where the Ventuari flows into the Orinoco, you boys can take the boat down through." When they reached the rapids, Mr. Brewster gave the helm to Biff, then told Kamuka to mind the bow and watch for rocks. Mr. Brewster went into the thatched cabin, but from there he kept a sharp lookout in case the boys ran into trouble. Biff realized that his dad was standing by in case of emergency, but unless something of the sort developed, Biff knew he would be on his own. What a thrill it was. Kamuka watched like a cat, to copy any move made by Jacome and the stolid natives who were warding off rocks from the bows of the other boats. Biff kept an eager eye on Whitman, Joe Nara, and the Weiwei who was piloting the kitchen barge. When Biff saw that they were watching the man in the bow, he did the same. Time and again, Kamuka would raise his paddle to jab at a threatening rock. Always, Biff handled the helm accordingly. Kamuka nodded his head admiringly. He was crediting Biff with being a wonderful pilot, never realizing that he was furnishing the tip-off that enabled his friend to demonstrate such skill. Twice, though, it was Kamuka's quick work with the paddle that staved off a crash on the rocks before Biff could bring the helm about. When at last they were drifting in the calm water below the rapids, Biff sprang forward over the thatched cabin and grabbed Kamuka's hand, exclaiming, "Great work, Kamuka. We make a perfect team." Kamuka smiled solemnly as he repeated, "We make perfect team." Mr. Brewster came from the cabin and clapped a hand on each boy's shoulder. "You do make a perfect team," he complimented. "Just remember it." They remembered it several nights later when they sat around the campfire after a Cajaro dinner. "Tomorrow," stated Mr. Brewster, "we come to the Maypures Rapids." "Can we take the boat down through them?" queried Biff. "I mean, Kamuka and I." "None of our boats will shoot the Maypures," said Mr. Brewster. "They are impassable. So are the rapids of the Atures, 40 miles below. A road has been built around both rapids so that trucks can transport us with our boats." Joe Nara gave a high-pitched snort. "That's where Serbot will be waiting for us," he declared. "That's for sure." "I'm not so sure," put in Hal Whitman. "After he sold us out to those Indians on the Cassiquiare, he probably headed back the other way, down the Rio Negro. Not if he figured we'd be coming down the Orinoco." Whitman and Nara both turned to Mr. Brewster to see if he could settle the argument. As he lighted his pipe, Mr. Brewster stated calmly, "It's about an even chance that Serbot came this way. If he did, he will probably be watching the road to see if we come through." "That's right," declared Nara. "We'd better keep a sharp lookout when we reach that portage."
"Serbot may be watching for us," agreed Mr. Brewster, "but he won't be able to make trouble for us there." "After what he's already done," argued Nara, "he might give us trouble anywhere." When they reached Sanariapo, the tiny village at the head of the upper rapids, Biff and Kamuka noticed some natives watching Igo and Ubi carry sacks of ore up over the sloping rock between the river and the highway, where transport trucks were waiting to load the boats as well as the cargo. The boys reported this to Biff's father, who talked with the truck drivers and learned that the hangers-on were simply hoping to pick up a few bolivars in Venezuelan money by helping load the trucks. But that didn't satisfy Joe Nara. "If they can't make a bolivar one way," he argued, "they may try another, like telling people about our gold ore." "Here at Sanariapo," stated Mr. Brewster, "there is no one for them to tell." "They might pass the word along to Puerto Ayacucho, below the lower rapids," returned Nara. "I'll go ahead on the first truck with Igo and Ubi so I can check on any rumors." It took most of the day to make trucking arrangements and to transport boats as well as cargo over the modern highway that spans the intervening streams on big steel bridges. Biff found the trip interesting, with stretches of open country and barren hills, as well as wooded slopes and forested areas. The highway followed the right bank of the Orinoco, which belongs to Venezuela, while the land on the other side of the river is part of the Republic of Colombia. At Puerto Ayacucho, they found Igo and Ubi waiting to load the ore sacks into Nara's monteria when it arrived. But there was no sign of Nara. According to Igo and Ubi, Nara had gone somewhere immediately after arriving in Puerto Ayacucho. But Mr. Brewster, inquiring at stores, hotels and elsewhere, was unable to find anyone who had even seen the old white-haired prospector. "The only place left," Mr. Brewster declared, chuckling, "is the governor's office. Maybe Joe Nara is having lunch with His Excellency. Should we try there?" "I don't think so," returned Hal Whitman dryly. "From the way Nara looks for trouble, we might do better if we asked at the local calaboose." Mr. Brewster smiled at that reference to the town jail. "I've already asked there," he said. Then turning to the boys, he added, "Look around for Nara, and if you don't have any luck, I guess we'll have to call on the governor's office to help us find him." Kamuka noticed some natives lounging near an old shack on the high bank of the river. "Maybe they have seen Senhor Nara," Kamuka said to Biff, "but you will have to ask them. They do not speak Portuguese as I do. They talk Spanish, which you understand." When they approached the group, Biff addressed the nearest native, who was huddled by the wall, his chin buried deep in his red bandana neckerchief and his gaze turned towards the river. "Oiga, amigo," began Biff. "Soy buscando un viejo son pelo bianco." Biff was saying that he was looking for an old man with white hair, but he got no further. The slouchy native came to his feet and spun about with a snarl. As Biff dropped back, he found himself staring into the vicious, hawkish face of Urubu. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of Brazilian Gold Mine Mystery by Andy Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Tomlinson. Chapter 19. Partners in Crime. "Look out, Biff, he may have a knife." The warning came from Kamuka as the Indian boy grabbed Biff's arm, hauling him away from Urubu. But there was no way for them to dodge, except toward the wall, as Urubu was between them and the corner of the building. Then, from around that very corner, came a limber figure, a thin man clad in dungarees and a big sombrero, whose tight fists moved like pistons as they jabbed at Urubu's face. Jolted backward, Urubu dropped the knife that he was pulling from beneath his shirt. Warding off a few blows, he turned and ran wildly for a landing below the riverbank. The boys turned to thank their rescuer, who had lost his big sombrero and was stooping to pick up the wide-brimmed hat. They were amazed when they saw his smiling face and white hair. The man who had routed Urubu was Joe Nara. "The way to spot snoopers," advised Nara, "is to go snooping for them."
Nobody would know old Joe Nara in this outfit, particularly with his white hair out of sight. Nara chuckled as he put on the sombrero, showing how quick and complete the change was. Then Nara pointed to the river where a small, squat motorboat was scudding downstream. "There goes Urubu," said Nara, with another rat who was waiting for him, probably Pepito. "They're going to tell their boss Serbot that the gold rush is coming his way." The boys couldn't see the boat closely because they faced the glare of the late afternoon sun. When they told Mr. Brewster what had happened, he agreed with Nara. "We'll keep going downstream, though," Mr. Brewster decided, "until we reach the rapids above Puerto Carino, the only town on the Colombian side of the river." "Can we go through those rapids?" asked Biff. "Yes, they are quite navigable," his father replied, "but that is where Serbot and his crew will be waiting to attack us. If we get by the rapids, we'll be all right, because Mr. Stannart should be at Puerto Carino in his yacht by this time." "Can he come that far up the Orinoco, Dad?" "Yes, he can make it," replied Mr. Brewster. "And in his letter he said he would, unless we met him further downriver. Since we have taken longer than the time he allotted us, we should find him there. Then we'll close the mining deal with you, Joe." "If we get there," put in Nara glumly. "We can't go around those rapids unless we take a back trail, and Serbot will be watching that, too." As the loaded flotilla continued down the river, Mr. Brewster continued to weigh the coming problem. He was hoping that a solution might crop up, and as the expedition approached the rapids, the answer came. Back from the river on the Venezuelan side stood an old, abandoned blockhouse, flanked by a few dilapidated mud huts. "We'll make camp there," Mr. Brewster decided. "We can bring enough supplies into the blockhouse to hold Serbot off if he tries to attack us." "Do you think he has spies watching for us now?" asked Biff. "Very probably," his father rejoined. "And when he learns that we aren't coming down the river, he will have to come up here to find us." Mr. Brewster signaled the other boats to shore, and when they landed, he explained full details of his plan. "Tomorrow, Nara," stated Mr. Brewster, "I want you to move your Wai Indians down by a back trail to the rapids. They should be able to creep up on Serbot's crew without his knowing it." Nara nodded agreement. "As soon as Serbot becomes impatient and starts up here," Mr. Brewster went on, "the Wai can spring a surprise attack on any men that he leaves there. Then, before Serbot has time to attack us here, we'll come down the river in the boats. We'll pick your men up at the rapids, where they will have cleared the way for us." "But what about my Monteria?" asked Nara, tilting his head in canny style. "It has all the gold ore, remember?" "We'll bring it with the other boats," promised Mr. Brewster. "It means more to me than to you, Nara, because you have lots more back at Eldorado. But these are the samples that I need to show Mr. Stannart and close the deal for Ajax." "But suppose Serbot does attack here?" "We'll drive him off from the blockhouse. When he sees that we are well fortified, he is sure to withdraw until he can bring up more men. Your Wai will have taken care of them. That's when we'll surprise him by dashing out to the boats and starting down the river." They spent the rest of the day bringing the supplies in from the boats and putting the blockhouse into shape. The small windows of the square, squatty building were equipped with screens, but most of them were in poor condition. Mr. Brewster insisted upon repairing them first. "Let's get fortified against mosquitoes and other insects for tonight," he suggested. "During the evening, we can strengthen the shutters and fix loopholes so as to fight off Serbot and his pests tomorrow or whenever they come this way." While the others worked late into the evening, Joe Nara strode about wearing a gun belt with 2 revolvers poking from its holsters, ready for trouble. Later, Nara and his Wai slept under netting on their Monterias so as to get a good rest. In the blockhouse, the other members of the party took turns at guard duty through the night. At dawn, Jacome awakened Biff, who was scheduled to take over at that time. From one of the screened windows, Biff saw the squatty figures of Iga and Ubi emerge from Nara's Monteria. They roused the other Indians and soon were stealthily moving off among the trees to seek a trail to the rapids. The next few hours were the longest that Biff had ever experienced. The others woke up, had breakfast, and strolled about the camp, but the very air seemed charged with expectancy. It would probably be mid-afternoon, perhaps even later in the day, before a move came from the other camp, if a move came at all. Mr. Brewster, Hal Whitman, and Jacome were all carrying their rifles fully loaded, but that was purely a matter of precaution. Nara's party can't have reached the rapids yet, Mr. Brewster told Biff and Kamuka. Even so, they won't make a move unless Serbot starts out with his main force. If he sends some men ahead, they may try some sniping, so naturally we must be ready. But that will show their hand. A sudden interruption came from the surrounding trees, the blasts of a dozen guns or more. Mr. Brewster wheeled and fired back from the spot where he was standing, midway between the blockhouse and the boats. Mr. Whitman and Jacome were nearer the blockhouse. They turned and fired too. A bigger volley answered from a wider angle, accompanied by the whine of bullets that were high but close. Whitman was shouting from near the blockhouse. "This way, quick, or you'll be cut off. Serbot is here with his whole outfit." Amid new gunbursts, Mr. Brewster made a rapid decision. He pointed the boys to the shore and told them, "Quick, get to Nara's monteria. Start it down the river, and don't stop until you reach Stannart's yacht." The boys were on the way, and Mr. Brewster was dashing back to the blockhouse to join Whitman and Jacome. He made it safely, although he drew the fire of Serbot's followers, who were now visible as they came clambering, shouting from the surrounding brush. But Biff and Kamuka were now beyond the range of immediate gunfire when they boarded the monteria. Then they had the big motor started, and the heavily loaded boat was plowing its way out to the middle of the Orinoco. When Biff looked back, he saw tiny figures on the shore, but the boat was now half a mile away, too far for bullets to reach it. Serbot staged a surprise attack of his own, Biff told Kamuka, who was with him at the stern. And Dad had promised Nara that he would get this monteria down the river. So here we are. "Soon we reach rapids," was Kamuka's comment. "I better get ready so we can work like team." The space under the thatched cabin was stacked with packs, as well as sacks of ore, so Kamuka didn't try to crawl through it to reach the bow of the boat. Instead, he scrambled over the low roof, picked up a paddle from the forward cockpit, and waved back to Biff as he took his position. Soon the white foam of the rapids showed ahead. Biff steered for what looked like the main channel, and the monteria was swept into a series of whirlpools that licked the sides of jutting black rocks. The contrasting color helped Kamuka ward off those obstacles, while Biff did some fancy piloting to keep to the channel. Then, as Biff veered from a new hazard in the shape of a sandbank, he saw what he had feared most. Human figures rose from the tall grass beyond the sandy shoal and aimed rifles directly at the swift-moving boat and the boys who manned it. They were Serbot's reserves, Biff realized, stationed here to block the flotilla if it came down the rapids. And Biff was sure he saw the gleaming face of Urubu in the midst of the group. Urubu was finding it an easy task with only a single monteria coming his way. He waved his hand as a signal to fire. As the rifles barked, Biff gunned the motor, adding enough speed to carry the boat from the path of fire. But Urubu's crew was aiming again, this time at point-blank range. Fortunately, their fire never came. The tall grass stirred behind them, and from it sprang Igo, Ubi, and the rest of Nara's Indians. The Waiways had been stalking Urubu's riflemen to the edge of the sandbank. The first blast of gunfire had given away the position of Urubu's men. Now, the Waiways were engulfing them like a human tidal wave, while Biff and Kamuka resumed their battle with the rapids, keeping the big, clumsy boat clear of the rocks and sand. Finally, the water subsided and they were chugging peacefully down the river past the little settlement of Puerto Carino and a great jutting point of sand where the Meta River flowed in from the left to join the Orinoco. Kamuka waved his paddle and pointed ahead. Moored well away from the channel was a sleek white craft that could only be Mr. Stannart's yacht, the Coronet. Though small, it had a trim build that marked it seaworthy, capable of braving the Caribbean, yet also suited to river travel. Smiling men in trim uniforms appeared on deck as Biff maneuvered the monteria alongside the yacht. The boys made their boat fast and clambered up a rope ladder to find Mr. Stannart coming from his cabin to greet them. Biff introduced Kamuka, then started to pour out his story in one breath. "Dad's upriver in a lot of trouble. Old Joe Nara is somewhere along the rapids, but we brought the gold ore from the mine, down there in the boat." Mr. Stannart smilingly interrupted, with a wave toward the cabin as he suggested, "Step in there and tell me all about it. I have a friend who would like to hear it too. You will agree when you meet him." The boys entered the compact cabin, then stopped short in amazement. Mr. Stannart's friend was smiling too, but in a way that was anything but pleasant, for both Biff and Kamuka had seen that fixed smile before. The man who awaited them in the cabin was Nicholas Serbot. End of chapter 19.